Good morning, good afternoon, good evening around the world. My name is Doug Brunke. I'm the founder and CEO of Global Chamber. Today, we have a very important Globinar on a topic we've never chatted about in Global Chamber. And I'm not sure why. It's probably because we haven't met Debbie before the last couple of years, and we just kind of didn't pull it together. But this is one of those topics that is lingering in the background almost in every workplace. And it's not something that a lot of people think about unless you're part of it and you're doing caregiving yourself. You almost certainly have people within your organization that are dealing with this on a day-to-day basis, caregiving to someone within their family, whether it's a child or whether it's an adult. And these are real issues that take away from work, and can be managed in a better, more professional way. And fortunately, we have two experts today who are going to take us through what some of those expert ways are. I was talking to the ladies prior to us kicking off, and I was mentioning that a lot of times the caregiving ends up being just part of what everybody does. You take care of your father or your mother. And in our case, my wife and mine, her father lived with us with Alzheimer's his last 4 years. And it was just one of those things that we did, primarily my wife, where she took care of her father, and he lived with us and we took care of him. And there were all sorts of interesting and fun stories, and then of course with Alzheimer's, there's all sorts of challenging stories as well. But you just do it as a matter of course. And nobody at work ever asked about it. Nobody was doing anything to help and support us, and vice versa. As a manager and executive myself, I barely ever thought about it. And even if I knew about it, I wouldn't even know what to do. So today we're going to change that. We're going to talk to people who know what to do. So I'd like to introduce first Debbie. I mentioned Debbie earlier. Her name is Debbie Howard. She's the chairman of the Carter Group, but she's also going to wear her other main hat today, and that's as the founder of Aging Matters International, AMI. Debbie herself had a long experience taking care of her mother, and she learned a lot from that experience. And through that learning experience, she's now basically compiled the information and with our other speaker, Robin Weeks, been able to put a book together where it explains and helps people who are going through it and executives who have people within their organization that are going through it, so they can be more successful and we can all be more productive at work, but also hopefully be more successful in our management of caregiving. Robin Weeks is the founder at My Pivotal Point. She's a co-author of the book that I mentioned earlier that we're going to hear more about here in a second. And so without further ado, I'd like to turn over the program to these two really smart and dedicated ladies so that we can learn more. I'd like to introduce Debbie and Robin. And Debbie, would you like to kick us off?
Okay, thanks so much, Doug. I just want to talk a little bit about my own experience with family caregiving. I was living the high life in Tokyo. I know we have a very international audience for this webinar, running my market research business there. And we were at about the 20-year point, I would say. And I got the call from South Carolina back in the States that my mom had been diagnosed with lung cancer. And I know many of you will be able to relate to the possibility or the probability of caregiving from afar. And I certainly was caregiving from afar for about 1 year there, while my mom had chemotherapy and lots of treatments. And I do have two younger sisters, so we were able to juggle our time. But at the end of a year, even just 1 short year, both of my sisters' family medical leave act time was gone. And I was the only one, because I was an entrepreneur, who was able to go back home and take care of my mom full time until she passed away. And it was possible even back then in 2007 to run a business from Tokyo, from South Carolina, from the dining room table where I had grown up eating meals. But it wasn't easy, obviously, and it was pretty much the hardest job I've ever done. And I was not very well equipped for it, being a normal marketing person with no nursing expertise. But I had to really work hard to take on some new skills. And I think perhaps the worst or most difficult part was the emotional terrain, which is really, really difficult. But we managed through, my family managed through, and I, as a market researcher, I just felt so committed to sharing my experience with other caregivers in hopes of helping them with their journeys. So I interviewed over 200 caregivers, and I put together a book on the caregiving journey. And I also now work helping companies put together programs. So it's become a real lifelong passion that I think will last me for the rest of my life as well. And I know Robin also has an interesting story of how she got involved.
Yeah, thanks, Debbie. And Doug, thank you so much for hosting us. This topic is really near and dear to my heart. I began caring for my mother when my father became terminally ill, and they were in their 80s, and my father died and my older brother died within a week of each other, 6 months after his illness was diagnosed. At that point, my mother was in another state. I was going there every month, once a month, to check on her. Little did I realize I was becoming her caregiver at that point in time, as is the case so frequently. You just do what family does. It was really becoming untenable for me to continue traveling across the state line every month to take care of her needs and make sure she was okay. So I moved her to live near me here in Virginia, where she lived until she died in 2018. And over those years, I own a corporate training and leadership training and coaching business. And I was teaching my leadership classes to managers, and they would keep mentioning to me on the side, oh, I just started caring for my mother, or I moved here from out of state to care for my mother, or my grandmother has moved into our home with us. And just like me, they were stressed, they were worried, they didn't know where to go for help or resources, they had no support, and they weren't telling anyone at work except for their direct colleagues. So that situation just opened my eyes. And after my mother died, I spent the year just doing a lot of reflection on the impact that my role as her caregiver had made on my life, and the meaning that it gave to me and what I was able to do for her. Initially, as I said, I just didn't think of myself as a caregiver. As she became older and more frail and needed more and more care, and she was not living in my home, she was in assisted living. And there were, hospital visits and ER visits and doctor visits and rehab and all these things. And it did hit me, someone says, you're a caregiver. And then after she died, I realized I need to do something about this. I don't want people to do this alone. I did it alone. I had no support. I have siblings who live far away and were not really here to help me. And I did not want anyone else to go through this alone. There are resources, and we're going to talk about some of that today. And we need to get the caregivers out from the shadows of the workplace, because it is costly to employers, it is costly to them. And we'll be talking about some of those statistics today as well.
Really appreciate it. Two very powerful stories, both very inspiring. Thank you both. Can you maybe in the next phase, I want to make sure that everybody realizes that if you have questions along the way, feel free to put them into the chat area or the Q&A area, and we'll be able to have about 10 minutes toward the end for your questions. If we don't get to them, we'll be able to do some follow-up as well. And so feel free to connect that way and get your thoughts and your questions in. So ladies, on the next series of information, I'm wondering, could you give us some of your favorite statistics to help the folks here on the Globinar understand why caregiving is an important issue for companies all over the world. And I'm sure it varies around the world. And so would love your perspective on that.
Sure, I'll lead off with that, Doug, if that's, so there are a lot of reports out there, and Debbie can speak to some of this research. We've both done a great deal of research about this topic, and it's amazing how much research there is available. Right now, there are 53 million people in the US caring for an aging adult or someone with some sort of functional need.
Wow.
And that's up 21% since 2015. So that's a pretty dramatic increase. 1 in 5 people are caregivers or expect to become one soon. And just a note on that expectation of becoming a caregiver, we don't frequently think of, as Debbie pointed out, she got called home because her mother was diagnosed with lung cancer. And frequently it is a crisis. A crisis occurs and you're thrown into this role with no preparation and no time to plan. And now what we're finding is that some people can begin to look at anticipating the role of caregiver as they look at their aging parents or grandparents or someone else in their family. Caregivers are all around us. All you have to do is walk down the hallway and probably 1 in 5 of those people you run into is a caregiver. They are in the grocery stores, they are in our churches, they are in our schools, and they are young and old. We call them family caregivers in order to make a distinction between the paid caregivers that you may hire to come into your home to help someone. Family caregivers are informal, unpaid caregivers. They have no training. They're, as we've all talked about so far, they're doing what family does. The Harvard Business School wrote a report a few years ago called The Caring Company. It's a fabulous report, really great information and statistics. And they found that about 73% of employees in the US are caring for a child, a parent, or a friend. And we know the boomers, they're aging. So in 2030, we're going to have close to 1 billion people over the age of 65, which will be more than any other age group in our population. Most caregivers are working full time, and on the average, they spend between 20 and 30 additional hours a week doing caregiving duties, tasks, and responsibilities. So in essence, they're juggling 2 jobs. Caregiving is a job, and it takes its toll when you're working full time. Debbie, I think you have some additional information.
I do. Thanks, Robin. And it is amazing to think that a caregiver, an average caregiver, is spending 20 additional hours a week in addition to their 40-hour-a-week job. So for those of you who do not caregive right now, just imagine having an extra 20 hours on you that you really cannot escape from. You go home from work and that starts. And this is happening all over the world. We estimate that at least 20% of every company's workforce, no matter where it is in the world, is providing care for adult loved ones at home. 20% of your workforce, and that's small, medium-sized enterprises as well as large companies. So it's across the board. Again, it's happening all over the world. We estimate, as Robin said, 1 billion people aged over 65 or more worldwide. This is just happening. It's about 10% of the worldwide population. My experience in Japan made me especially interested in the aging phenomenon because Japan is the most aging population in the whole world. And I'll just give you one statistic that's really interesting. The average age of a caregiver in the States is 49. The average age in Japan is 65. So we have a lot of the oldest couples taking care of each other as well in Japan because of that aging society. So this is happening globally in all developed countries. And we in the US are we're not far behind Japan. So about 30% of Japan's population will be 65 or more by the year 2025. That's 5 years from now. 30% of the population in the United States, the comparable statistic is 20%. That's huge. It's huge when you think about the burden on our medical and healthcare systems, and our family caregivers who probably aren't getting the kind of support that they need. I just want to say that because I know we have a very global audience today. So it is an important issue. A lot of our statistics in our ebook are US centric, because that's where a lot of the good research comes from. But I also have some global stats that show that this is a very much a worldwide problem. So I hope that our listeners will appreciate that it's happening in those societies as well.
Amazing statistics. That was even before the pandemic, I would guess, right? I'm not sure what's changed since then, but I guess it probably hasn't got better. What challenges are you seeing that have made it even a more significant challenge for people that are going through this?
Well, Doug, COVID has really, to use a metaphor, taken the covers off of the inefficiencies in our care facilities here in the US. This is where some of the first cases hit in this country, our most vulnerable populations. And while many of those facilities provide a very good and high quality level of care, the majority of them are grossly understaffed. And so that presents a problem in itself. My mother was in assisted living, and I can tell you, it did not relieve me from caregiving duties or responsibilities, as many people might think. That is not the case. And in many cases, you have more to do because they are so understaffed. And so it takes it upon yourself to really look after that individual if they're not living in your home in a different way. So COVID has made it more difficult. Many caregivers have made the choice to pull a loved one out of a care facility and bring them home. Now they have a whole nother level of stress in their lives. They're working from home in so many cases now. The sandwich generations are juggling, trying to school their children and care for their children. And now perhaps they've got an older adult or a grandparent in their home caring for them as well. So you can imagine the level of stress that's creating. And COVID in itself creates stress with the way we have to operate in the world today. And add into that caring for someone, and you've made the decision to bring them home, or if you've not made the decision to bring them home and they're still in their care facility, you haven't been able to visit them. And that poses a whole nother set of problems for the individual: isolation, social isolation, lack of interaction, and so forth. And you can't go inside and give them a hug.
Yeah, so heartbreaking. And we've also seen, I think, with COVID that even people, let's say you were just supporting a parent who was aging in place, who really didn't need very much help. Maybe they were doing fine on their own, but now you're fearful that when they go to the store, they'll expose themselves. So you weren't really that much of a caregiver before. You were maybe a light caregiver, but now you're having to do a lot more to make sure that your elder parent is safe. So it's a real problem. And I think that COVID, I'm always trying to look for the good side of COVID, just because I'm trying to be positive, but it has pulled the covers off, as Robin said, in a lot of areas of our healthcare system, and especially with our assisted living. I think it's also shown companies that we have millennial and Gen X aged caregivers. So not just, again, there was this picture of a typical 49-year-old woman being the average caregiver here in America and pretty much worldwide. But what we're finding is that literally of those 53 million caregivers that Robin mentioned, a quarter of them are millennials. That's huge. And that's something that we didn't know until last year. We knew that last year, right before COVID. Now it's even more. We also know that we've got about a quarter of those being males. So it's not all females. There are male caregivers as well, more and more. And we even have, of course, we have the sandwich caregivers who are, like I have one friend who has a 9-year-old at home who she's homeschooling, and a mom who's an 8-hour drive away, who she's supporting from afar. very, very difficult. I think there are so many situations and stories that we know are happening these days, and we just, I think it's a good thing that it's helping us to shine a light on this issue in our society.
You've both laid down really important groundwork in terms of what's actually happening out there, and so that we can all recognize what the issues are there. Let's shift gears a bit and talk now about the companies and companies that what they can do. And specifically, let's shift over to what's important for companies to think about for their working caregivers.
As Debbie pointed out, Doug, the diversity of caregivers in the workplace is growing. That stereotypical 49-year-old woman is no longer the case. 40% of caregivers are men. And as she pointed out as well, 25% of caregivers are millennials, and that is growing on a daily basis. We know that the boomers make up the largest percentage of caregivers at 34%. And now we're starting to see Gen Z come into the caregiving world, representing 6% of the population. I've encountered so many caregivers that are in their mid-30s at the peaks of their careers. And one individual came up to me after one of my leadership classes and said, I've just moved my grandmother into my home. My house is chaos. I have 3 kids, and I had to turn down a promotion. So this is part of the problem in the workplace. They're not talking about it, and they're turning down promotions or job offers because of the additional stresses of caring for someone.
Those are significant issues for sure.
Yeah, some of the things that happen with caregivers in the workplace is what we call absenteeism. So they get a call, your mother's had a fall, or we're taking your parent to the ER, or just like a child, that person's sick, so you have to be there with them. So that's a growing problem. The other problem with caregivers in the workplace that occurs frequently is what we refer to as presenteeism. They're not really present. They're distracted. Their level of productivity begins to decrease. They're on the phone. When I cared for my mother for 6.5 years, I had my phone with me 24/7. It was never turned off. It never left my pocket anywhere I went. And those caregivers are in that same situation, whether that individual is in a care facility or that individual is in their home. They are on call. And that's a very stressful place to be. One of the things that we know is that the healthcare of caregivers suffers. 21% in 2020, 21% of caregivers said that their own health is poor due to their responsibilities being a caregiver. We also know that 32% of caregivers at some point may opt to leave the workforce due to their additional responsibilities. It just becomes too great of a burden. And that is a talent gap for companies. That cost to companies of employees leaving and having to replace them is $6.6 billion annually. And overall, the cost of recruiting, retaining, and training someone new can cost companies up to $38 billion annually.
And I think
those are significant negative impacts.
Yes, they are, Doug. And this is all like extremely well documented, by the way. We'll talk about that in a minute. Of course, I'm very excited about my research, but and everyone else's research as well. But honestly, it is super well documented, and it's happening worldwide. All of these things that Robin mentioned, so the physical and emotional health problems that caregiving often brings on, more than not. In other words, more caregivers suffer physical health problems and emotional health problems than not. And also financial strain and stress, all kinds of burdens, and loss of job and career mobility. So I think those are all really, really important factors, and they're happening all over the world. They happen a little bit differently in different cultures. I can speak to Japan, for example. Obviously, if you have national health care, it could be a little different than if you don't have national health care. But even without, it's still a huge strain on the working caregiver. And in Japan, for example, they have some pretty good supports, but many people end up leaving their jobs. And we even have a problem in Japan because it is such an obligation. Like, I think in the US, we've tended over the years to outsource some of our elder care, if you will. And we have a huge wide range of assisted living and nursing facilities. In Japan, they only have like really expensive ones and state supported ones. So there's nothing in the middle for most people. And so the care is given at home. And that's a cultural imperative in Japan and many of the Asian countries. Sometimes there's good enough support, sometimes not. In Japan, we're seeing a rise in suicide rates of caregivers and their care receivers, like double suicide kind of deals, because it's just unbearable at a certain point for some people. What Robin and I believe is that it's time for companies to start thinking about supporting the lifespans of our employees, not just the birthdays and the nice things that happen when you're giving birth to young people, but also the end of life when you take care of your aging loved ones. It's called lifespan culture. We know that's a new buzzword in employee assistance programs. We have programs in companies that help employees with alcoholism, with drug abuse. We help them with financial planning and retirement planning. Why not with caregiving? That's what we're here to talk about today.
Debbie, you've got a wealth of knowledge and also a body of research that you're aware of around this topic. Could you share a little bit more about that?
Sure. And I don't want to bore everybody with all the long names. I'm going to throw out some names. I want you all to know that you can download Robin's and mine's ebook from the Global Chamber website, and it has all the stats that we're talking about today. There are some amazing long-term studies. There's one from the national, it's called the National Study of Employers. And it's been going on for over 20 years. And it's done now in conjunction with SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management. So that's a very good sign that things are coming to the fore in terms of HR management. These are long-term repetitive tracking measurements, and they allow comparisons over time. So that's very, very valuable. There's also two very well-known business coalition group studies, one by the Northeast Business Group on Health, very Fortune 500 membership, survey of 129 large employers in the US nationwide that has got some fabulous data in it. And also one from REACT, Respected Caregivers Time, which represents more than 40 companies and nonprofit organizations. Those are three biggies that have been doing research for quite a while. One of the most exciting and highest profile pieces of work that we've had recently was done by Harvard Business School in 2017. And that's called The Caring Company: How Employers Can Help Employees Manage Their Caregiving Responsibilities. And we think that one is the one that's going to get the most uptake with most people because it's Harvard. And it's a great study, and it really, really tells the story of why caregiving is such an important issue to companies these days. And it encourages companies to develop caring cultures and lifespan cultures, like we were talking about. There's also one hot off the press from spring this year from the National Alliance for Caregiving and AARP. AARP is also a sponsor of some of those other studies that I cited. And this is a 23-year ongoing study on caregiving landscape. And it's got great data in it about who caregivers are and what they struggle with. And then one of my favorites on the global scene is from Merck out of Germany. It's called the 2017 Carers Report. Sometimes caregivers are called carers in the rest of the world. Embracing the critical role of caregivers around the world. It's a white paper and action plan done by Merck, which started a nonprofit foundation called Embracing Carers. And they're doing some excellent work with coalitions around the world to highlight the issues of caregiving in the workplace. So we've highlighted many of the key findings from these studies in our ebook. And I just want to remind listeners that there are some fabulous resources out there, and all of those you can get PDF 40, 50-page reports. If you want to dig into the details like Robin and I have here, you can download all those reports, and the links are all in our ebook. Just summarizing the 3 big takeaways from all of these reports, and there are so many. When it comes to flex time and paid off, what working caregivers value and need most is time and flexibility. Robin mentioned the call you get in the middle of the day. You can't know when an emergency is going to happen. When it comes to resources and support, one of the hidden barriers to preventing workplaces from being more caregiving friendly is that there's a stigma attached to being a caregiver. For some reason, it's expected that we would have had a better plan than our mother would have gotten sick and we couldn't work full time anymore. I'm sorry to make light of it. I'm not making light of it, but it's amazing to me that there's a negative stigma attached to caregiving. But there is. It's somehow you've done something wrong, so then you don't tell your employer of all the stress that you're under. And then when it comes to recruiting and retaining employees, there is a proven positive return on investment for policies that enable caregivers to balance their jobs with their caregiving responsibilities. And the fact that we have from these research studies, for every dollar invested in flexible work arrangements, businesses can expect a return ranging from $1.70 to $4.34. That's a lot. That's a lot of good return. And I'm sorry to have that in dollars for our international audience.
Yeah, that's just fine. No worries. In the next section, we're going to be talking about 3 easy wins that companies of any size, no matter where they are in the world, can think about in terms of how to actually take a next step here. Robin, I think you're going to be talking a little bit about that and kicking off this section. Oh, are you on mute?
Sorry. Yeah, thanks, Doug. Yeah, so 3 things. Start a conversation, and that conversation has to start at the executive level. It has to start with top management and the HR department. And this is for any company, anywhere in the world. The conversation has to start so that those caregivers can come out and talk about their roles. And that starts to create a culture, a compassionate culture that lets them feel comfortable talking about what they're doing. That conversation can start anywhere within the organization. They can bring in experts such as Debbie and myself to do lunch and learns, webinars, distribute literature, distribute some of the research in parcels. As Debbie said, some of these are 50-page long reports. So parts of them are very relevant if you just extract some of it. But start the conversation. That's the first place. Secondly, take a census. The AARP has, and there's a link to this in our ebook, has a wonderful census form that you can use. Take a census of the employees in your company who are caregivers. This way you know how many they are, and it's probably a surprising number. And the third one is review your benefits, assess and review those benefits. As Debbie just pointed out, her sister ran out of her Family Medical Leave Act within a year. Many people, many caregivers will not use their personal time off or PTO for caregiving. And many of the benefits, or as companies sometimes refer to them, accommodations, that they make miss the mark. They're not what caregivers need. Caregivers report needing support, subsidies in some cases if they're paying for in-home care, which can run well over $50,000 a year. Caregivers need personal support. They need someone to sit and listen to their stories and someone to provide them with resources. As we've both pointed out, there's a lot of information out there. But when you are in the role of a caregiver, you don't have time to sit down in front of Google for an hour and try and find the resource that you need to solve your problem. You need someone to say, what's your problem? Let's go, let me give you a resource. So helping someone in the workplace through support, and that support comes along as well with educating the managers and the executive. That conversation comes through education of those individuals as well as to what caregiving is in the workplace for an individual.
Sounds good. I heard three things: start the conversation, take a census, and then review the benefits. And you started going through some of those. That all sounds very doable. Maybe the devil's in the details. Debbie, could you give us maybe some tangible examples of best practices by companies who've made a decision that this is something that they want to do? Oh, Debbie, are you there?
That mute thing gets you every time, doesn't it? Yeah, there are some great examples of going beyond the foundational practices, which we would love to see every company do the survey and assess their employees, repurpose what programs they have maybe for working moms and other flexible situations, and develop programs for caregivers. Also communicating and nurturing and creating a supportive culture for caregiving. Those are all critical. But let me just give you a few examples of some really interesting things that some of the companies, some of the leaders are doing in the best practice area. So emergency backup care. So nearly half of those surveys already provide this type of care with subsidized care, emergency backup care for those times when you get the call, ranging from 10 to 30 days a year. Digital concierge services that can help support time-pressed caregivers of adults. On-site support from an elder care consultant who can help coordinate access to benefits and resources for employees who are caregiving, and can also advise on care options. And there's also some companies offering on-site or off-site access to care coordinators who can work directly with the employees and their families. One that I love is a time bank that allows non-caregiving employees to donate their vacation or sick days to a coworker who's a caregiver. I love that one. And of course, using the company Intranet to create private community space for caregivers. So even to the point of creating a system where if I were a caregiver, I could connect up all my family members through my company's website to the medical information so that we could all access it easily. Some companies are doing that. Some companies are providing time and space for support groups. So if you had a large enough employee population, for example, and you had, let's say, 3 to 5 caregivers of Alzheimer's patients, those caregivers could band together and have a support group of their own that was supported by the workplace. And they could be trained to moderate that on their own. So they don't have to have, obviously, you can hire professionals to come in, but you can also train caregivers to help themselves that way. I think those are a few good examples, some of my favorites.
Those are pretty nifty. I like those.
And they're pretty easy. They're pretty easy and cheap too. This doesn't have to cost a lot of money. It has to take time and effort and caring.
Yeah, it seems like the biggest step is just caring. the recognizing that this exists and doing something very relatively simple to address it.
Mhm, mhm.
So that's kind of where we're going to go next with, and we're going to go into Q&A, but before we do that, we'd like to address what you as Global Chamber members can do kind of as a next step. If you're interested in doing something, what would that look like? And so Robin, would you like to kick us off on that?
Sure, Doug. So I think we've pretty much already stated that, and that is to start a dialogue, start the conversation, talk with your employees. We know clearly these employees are not coming forth. They may tell their direct manager, but they're not telling management anywhere else. They know what their caregiving role is costing them in terms of time and productivity in the workplace. And so they're very careful about that. They're afraid of missing opportunities. So I think it's really important for the leadership of an organization to do some research, become informed about caregivers in the workplace, become informed about what the benefits that they want are. The report that the Caring Company by the Harvard Business School is excellent at outlining those benefits. And initiate that conversation all the way through the organization. So start with HR, start having lunch and learns, and start the dialogue is the first step to doing this if you're a leader at an organization. Secondly, just to throw another bug in, download our book. Our ebook outlines a number of steps that you can take and some quick, easy wins. And as Debbie pointed out, this is not an expensive undertaking. It's not a total revamping of your benefits program. It's an assessment of what you offer and maybe perhaps layering in some other benefits on top of that to help organizations support those caregivers. And just to reiterate Debbie's comment, it is about creating a lifespan culture. We celebrate birth. We should be celebrating and honoring those that care for the elderly and those at the end of their life as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Robin. And the third thing that Global Chamber members can do, if you would like, you can schedule a free consultation with Robin and I. We can do it over Zoom just like this. And we'll chat with you for 30 minutes or so about your situation in your company and what you might be able to do. We can brainstorm ideas with you. And obviously we do offer services. If you like what we have to say and you want to do a program, that's okay too. But we are more than happy to brainstorm with you and help you get started. It is a matter of caring and looking at what you've got and seeing what you can do in addition to what you're already doing. And some of it is just repurposing things that you're already doing. A lot of companies have some programs, but they're not publicizing them to caregiving employees. So they're not packaged and communicated in a way that makes them accessible to their caregiving employees. And of course, nurturing that caring culture in a company is a whole other thing. So it could be as simple as having a story about a working caregiver in your employee publication, so that you show as a company that you celebrate the wonderful work that your employees are doing in their spare time, in addition to all the other work that they do.
And I'll just, one quick tag on to that, Doug, to circle back around to how you introduced yourself with us this evening, to your caregiving journey, that where your wife cared for her father. And I think as an executive, that happens so frequently. I know a lot of executives, since I've been talking about this, have shared with me how that's been their journey as well. And they haven't talked about it at work either. So we know that the top levels of management are having this role and responsibility in their lives. And so it's easy for them to begin to think about how it's affecting them, and then open that dialogue up to everyone else within their companies.
Thanks. I will now kind of phase into Q&A, and I'd like to kind of start off of you're kind of leading me into that. One of the questions is regarding kind of the range of caregiving. How do you view it? in my case, as you mentioned, it was my father-in-law. I think that's the normal type process, but there's certainly children that are taken care of, and there are other cases, maybe even yourself. There are people that have significant health problems themselves, and do you consider that to be caregiving as well? So how do you kind of broadly define caregiving and the needs of employees as they go forward?
Caregiving, you're correct. That's such a good point, Doug. It comes in so many forms. So I have been working with a woman who was caring for her elderly mother, but also her husband who has Parkinson's. My brother's wife has Parkinson's. Those are caregivers too. An adult caring for a child who perhaps has functional needs on the autism spectrum, or perhaps they have cerebral palsy or one of these diseases. Those are caregivers too. So while Debbie and I like to focus on those caring for aging adults, because that's been our personal experience and level of expertise, we don't neglect those other caregivers. It runs the gamut in terms of who they are and who they're caring for. In Debbie's case, as she shared with you, her mother had a terminal diagnosis of lung cancer. Many caregivers spend on the average 4.5 years caring for someone. And that's the average length of time. Sometimes it's shorter due to a terminal illness, and sometimes it's longer, as was in my case. So just understanding there is a span of time, sometimes it changes and is different, and there is definitely a span of needs of that person being cared for.
Yes, and COVID has really shown everyone what it's like to feel like to be a caregiver. Actually, it's shown us all, whether we're directly caregiving for somebody or not, how it feels to be isolated, and how it feels not to be able to go out and see your friends, how it feels to not to constantly be worried about catching something, and worried about keeping your immune system bolstered up. For example, when I was caring for my mom, I was terrified that I was going to catch a cold and give it to her. It would have been the end of her. And so I was so careful. If I saw anybody with a sniffle, it was like this, and I had all kinds of things to bolster my immune system up. But we all know how that feels now with COVID. COVID has really shown us how that feels, and it's turned everybody into caregivers. Even I love Robin's definition of that spectrum of caregiving, but of course, a mom now, let's say my friend, the sandwich caregiver, whose mom is 8 hours away, who's 70 something, has the 9-year-old at home. That 9-year-old doesn't have anything like cerebral palsy or autism, but she has needs now that she did not have before, that are right there in the home. So it's pretty intense. I think COVID has really shown us all what it feels like to be a caregiver.
Really, really good points. The next question is from down your way, Debbie. Christopher Herring, Global Chamber San Antonio, is asking, what are some of the more innovative approaches that you've seen, either with children or caring for adults? What are some of the things that COVID-19 is inspiring, perhaps, that may be changing the game, and maybe some things that will be used from a long-term basis?
Well, I think one of the good outcomes is that we all know now that people can be productive working at home. That's a good thing. That's a good thing. That's a good thing for caregivers who had to work at home and were often feeling bad about it, but actually they can be very productive even if they're caregiving at home. I think that's a good thing. I think one problem for caregivers with aging parents, let's say you've brought your parent home, you now may have trouble going back to work because you don't want to expose yourself and bring it back into the home. So maybe before your parent was living separately from you and they weren't at such risk. So that's another consideration that we didn't have before COVID. And I guess I think Chris had a direct question there I saw in the chat about what is the most innovative business approach to childcare during COVID-19? And that is such a big question, Chris. Thank you. It's not got easy answers. I'm hoping Robin has a good innovative example as well. I've heard of companies actually giving extra stipends or budgets to parents with kids at home to have some caring help for those children or for the parents. That doesn't sound that innovative to me, but I do think it has come about as a result of COVID. Robin, have you heard of anything interesting in terms of companies offering help and support to people who are caring at home these days?
I think one of the things that I've heard of recently is companies offering tutors. So where a parent may be having to divide their day into seeing that their child is online taking Zoom classes, which we both know can wear us out, it'll wear a kid out. They are providing tutors paid by the company to help with that learning and education process. So it takes some of the burden off of the parent to have to daily monitor or help that student through their classes on Zoom.
Cool. No, that's got to be helpful. Great.
And I think we're just getting started with that as well, Doug, because now companies are starting to try to figure out how to get employees back to work, and it's all very, very up in the air right now with the COVID thing. So I think hopefully the next few months we'll see some more innovations as well. Chris, to your point.
Yeah. Are there other maybe the way to think about this is, are there companies that and I think it was Robin who mentioned about Merck and some of the things they've done. Are there certain companies that kind of stand out are in this area and that we can look at and model? And I presume they would probably be in the ebook.
Actually, well, you go.
Some of the bigger companies, Starbucks has begun offering subsidies to the caregivers in their employee.
Okay.
They've also offered them much more paid time off, up to 30 days, when they need to leave to care for someone. I think Microsoft is another one of the major companies that is offering subsidies and on-site support care for caregivers. Debbie, you might remember some of the other companies. A lot of them are very large companies that have recognized this issue and begun to address it.
One of them that made headlines was Deloitte back in 2016, offering, like triple the time of other companies in terms of time off, flexible time off. And the report from React, it's R small e big ACT. You'll see that source in our ebook. That report has 14 case studies, Doug, of companies, and they're all major, like Amex and different Fortune 500 type companies, and some of the innovative approaches they've done.
Got it. We only have about 5 minutes, and there are at least a couple more questions that we want to get to. One of them relates, Debbie, to your expertise on Japan and maybe by analogy, cultures that are have caregiving built in, where especially with elderly care, they live at home. And so are companies that in Japan and maybe in Korea and China would be somewhat comparable, are they more progressive relative to this, or the opposite? I'm thinking back on my Japan days, and I'm wondering, kind of like, nobody really cared. This was part of what you did, and I mean, they cared. That's an over exaggeration, but there wasn't like a company process around that. You just had to keep coming to work.
Yes.
And so how do you view that in Asian culture versus contrasting with Americas and the European cultures?
Well, I think the Asian cultures tend to be more, they're acculturated to take care of their parents at home.
Yep.
That is the de facto first stop, rather than outsourcing your elder care, which is more of what we do. So in Japan, you will find far less penetrated incidents of assisted living homes. So there are a long waiting list for assisted living facilities, for example, and you'll see many, many more, let's say 85, 90-year-old couples living together, taking care of each other and hiding it from their kids so that they don't get put in a home. So you'll see a lot of really interesting things like that happening. You also see in Japan, and I think in the Asian cultures, but I know Japan the best, you'll see that the eldest son is still traditionally responsible for caring for the parents. And the inheritance goes all to the eldest son. If you're the middle or the young child, forget it. You don't get anything. And the reason you get that inheritance is because you're the one with your wife and your kids who are going to break down the family house and rebuild a multiple family dwelling that accommodates the parent or parents and the nuclear family of the eldest son. So that's an interesting way that it has traditionally happened in Japan. What we're seeing now is that some of the wives who really are the ones who end up taking care of the in-laws, it's not the eldest son, it's the wife. We've seen a lot of wives start saying, I'm not doing that. So there are things happening in Japan, as we all know, when you're involved in Japan, that are quite interesting over time. And I think, to your point, Doug, I think companies probably are not as far along as we are in the States in terms of identifying this as a benefit that needs to be called out. And that's a sad state of affairs, because we aren't as far along as we need to be here in the States, if you ask me. But I think that Japan has a way of moving very quickly once it gets with the program. So I know there are little glimmers of the discussion in Japan, and I'm trying to push over there as well.
Got it. I will say that, as a follow-up to this conversation, we mentioned it before, we will provide the link to the free ebook. I think it's either going to be in a blog post or in a news item, and we'll definitely get to it to everybody who's attending today, but we'll have it up online within the next few days. So watch for that. It's called Employer's Guide, Workplace Support for Family Caregivers. And so watch for that shortly. I'd like just to give you each, 30 seconds, a minute, just as a wrap up, and then we'll close it out. Robin, would you like to go first? Anything that we should keep in our mind? Anything else you'd like to cover?
I think we've covered a lot of ground today, Doug. Thank you for hosting. This has really been wonderful for you to do this. It is a global problem, as we have a more aging population. And for me, as I said, it's very near and dear to my heart. My caregiving for my mother had a huge impact on my life, clearly, which is why I've incorporated this into my leadership training and coaching business. And I think it's time for us, which is why we're here today, clearly to bring this into the workplace and help these caregivers that are struggling with basically two jobs, and to help educate employers around the world as to the ways that they can support caregivers. And just to reiterate, create that culture that's a lifespan culture. Caregiving enters our lives at different points. And usually one of the things that happens is it exits our life. And for those caregivers that choose to leave the workforce due to the burden of caregiving, there comes a time for them, they want to re-enter the workforce, which is another place where employers, if they're supporting them along this journey, they can tap into those caregivers as they need to re-enter the workforce. Thanks, Doug.
Thank you. And you've both made it clear individually and together how important this topic is. Debbie, would you like to say a couple words in conclusion?
Sure. I couldn't say it any better than Robin. And honestly, I just we are just so thankful to you for watching, and we know we've downloaded a lot of facts and figures on you. The ebook is very easy to read, and you can learn everything and see everything there. I just really would like to leave everyone with the thought that this is a special employee segment like any other, and we need to be thinking about it. It's a business issue, and it's risk management to be progressive and think about how are we going to help our working caregivers.
You've opened up our eyes and minds to this idea. Thank you so much to both of you. We'll have that blog post up, and you'll have this information, all of you who have participated today. And so check it out, learn more, and definitely connect in. If you're interested in connecting right immediately, send an email to info@globalchamber.org, and we'll make sure that you get connected to one or both of the ladies who spoke today. Thank you both. You're both extraordinary. You've given us so much to think about and so much to act on. Thanks for your time, and we want to wish you the best. In your case, actually, both of you are here in the U.S., but Robin a little bit later in the evening. So wishing you a good evening, and maybe Debbie, you a good dinner time, and welcome and thank you to all of you around the world, whatever time zone you're in. Have a good rest of your day. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.